Welcome to the History Bards Historical Movie Reviews. It's movie time starting in 4, 3, 2, 1. With your hosts, Michael Zucker and Marley. Today's movie review: Schindler's List, directed by Steven Spielberg.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the History Bards podcast. This is your host, Michael Zucker, author of the Eisenhower Chronicles, and with me today is my co-host,
Marley. Hey, everyone.
We have another classic historical fiction film to discuss with you today. Before we get to that, I just want to briefly mention that as we're recording this yesterday, Cormac McCarthy, usually considered the greatest living American writer, sadly passed away at the age of 89. I was very fond of him. He was a major inspiration for me as a writer. Some of my favorite works of his were Blood Meridian, The Road, No Country for Old Men, and several others. So the film that we're discussing today is Schindler's List, which is usually considered not only one of the greatest historical fiction films, but likely one of the 10 greatest American films. We can kind of discuss our thoughts on sort of its place in film history a bit later. So directed by Steven Spielberg, it was released in December of 1993. It would win both Best Director and Best Picture at the 1994 Oscars. Want to briefly mention, since this podcast is usually dedicated to historical fiction novels, that Schindler's List, before becoming a landmark film, started off as a novel by Thomas Keneally. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And just kind of briefly touch on some of the backstory of why he wrote it. That I believe so Mr. Keneally is Australian. He was visiting the United States. I don't remember if it was New York or LA, but he went into a store to, I believe, purchase luggage, and he met the owner of the store, who was Mr. Pfeffelberg, who is one of the, as they're called, one of the Schindler Jews. And when Mr. Keneally mentioned that he was a writer, Pfefferberg said, I have the best story of the 20th century for you to write. And so that was sort of the beginning of kind of how this story emerged, both as a novel and then a film. And sort of for historical fiction writers, the fact that, the novel went on to become not just, a Spielberg film, but, arguably his greatest film that would, win Best Picture. I think it's his only movie that won Best Picture. Just kind of shows, how far, our work as historical fiction writers can potentially rise.
Yes, absolutely. And for those who don't know, the title of that book is Schindler's Ark. And so, if anybody was wanting to look that up to read it, that's the title.
Actually, I think it was re-released as Schindler's List.
Oh, really? Did it? Okay.
Yeah, because I think I actually asked the Barnes when I was interested in it. I think in January, I originally I asked a Barnes and Noble if they had Schindler's Ark, and they didn't know what in their system they couldn't find that, and then it turns out it was retitled, I guess, to match the film.
Okay.
And so I read the book in April to kind of see how it functioned as a novel versus the film version.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite different, actually. It's much more detailed in terms of like how Schindler's business operated. It's also, it's obviously there's a lot of violence, in it, violence depicting the Holocaust, but I would say considerably less than the film version. Whereas that's, usually considered the film's defining quality is portraying that. And I think that was, less so within the novel. I think the novel also kind of goes deeper into Oskar Schindler's sort of character psychology and portraying him as well as his backstory, sort of like who he was before the events of World War II and the Holocaust. Interestingly, the novel also, I feel like, was more sympathetic to him, or at least made less of an effort to sort of have this dramatic shift in his character from sort of a selfish businessman into somebody who saved over 1,000 Jews. And more shows that, like, yes, he was a businessman pursuing his own interests, but I think it shows a faster understanding of what was going on and what he both could and should do about it.
Oh, wow.
Um,
I've never read the book. I must say I've never read the book, so that's quite an interesting comparison. That happens a lot in with books, how they change whenever they're made into a film. But I thought it was really interesting whenever I was doing my own research about how that in the research it says that in 1951 that Pfeifferberg approached Fritz Lang and asked him to consider making a film about Schindler, and that in 1964, I think it was, that Schindler received $20,000 advance from MGM, and they were going to title it To the Last Hour, but that films were never made, and then I think it was like Spielberg got it. I thought it was really interesting that he said that he was not emotionally or professionally ready whenever he bought the rights to it. I thought, and that's understandable, because to make such a powerful and emotionally charged film, I understand that he had to be ready.
Right, and that's something I wanted to also discuss was, I mean, obviously Steven Spielberg needs no real introduction, but to kind of to show kind of where this film kind of wasn't just another film for him. It's, a key part of both his legacy and kind of a turning point in kind of what his career represented. And they would just, want to mention that that one of the films that helped inspire him to become a director is another great historical fiction epic, Lawrence of Arabia. And that, I think the way that I read the way his career played out was that, he started by making, kind of large blockbuster adventure films such as Jaws, Indiana Jones, and E.T., that I think he always sort of hoped or was planning that at some point he could sort of become an heir to David Lean and also make sort of great, epic, historical fiction films. And that, coming from a Jewish background, that to him, that the Holocaust was sort of like the ultimate, most important topic to capture within a film. And it's interesting that, so E.T., which is sort of like the climax of the first phase of his career when he was really just focusing on blockbusters, that the weekend that film came out, he received a book review of Schindler's Ark. And so that was 1982. That's when he learned of this topic. And, as you just said, he did not think he was sort of emotionally ready or mature enough to tackle, such an important subject at that time. And so he essentially waited 10 years. And he did a couple of earlier dramatic films to kind of get himself ready with, the experience of tackling heavier material. The first was The Color Purple, and the second was Empire of the Sun. And so by doing both of those, he sort of built up the experience to do heavier dramatic work. And then, as is kind of famously said, that in 1993 he released Jurassic Park in the summer, which became the highest grossing film up to that point. And then 6 months later released Schindler's List, which would win Best Picture and is considered, probably one of the 10 greatest American films. So that's probably like, easily, the defining year of his career.
And I thought it was really interesting. And I had no idea about this either, that it said that he this project was actually prepared for Martin Scorsese, and that he
Right.
actually transferred, like they switched, like he
Yeah.
took Schindler and Martin Scorsese took Cape Fear. So it's like
Right.
really interesting how different it might have been, through Scorsese's eyes than Spielberg's eyes. It would have been interesting.
Right. Well, because I think what happened, so Spielberg, I think, bought the rights to Schindler's Ark. And then because he thought he wasn't kind of up to the task, gave it to Martin Scorsese.
Mhm.
And then asked for it back and ended up trading Cape Fear for it. Because he decided, this was something he had to do. But Schindler's List would sort of help to establish Spielberg not just as a great blockbuster director, but also as a sort of a serious director, and would pave the way for films like Amistad, Saving Private Ryan, Lincoln, and probably half a dozen other sort of historical fiction films that he's made in the years since.
Definitely.
And then also just kind of going back to, so I think not only was, he initially inspired by Lawrence of Arabia, but I suspect if you asked him that when he was making Schindler's List, he was probably even thinking like this was going to be his Lawrence.
Yeah.
And I think you can even see that in the very opening of it, that it opens with sort of traditional Jewish candles burning down, and then the color goes and becomes black and white, and then it instantly switches to a German train that's going to load Jews to take them out of Krakow. And I think you can say that by doing that, by having the candles burn out and then instantly switch to like a major image like that, that's a tribute to what film fans will recognize as the match cut in Lawrence of Arabia, where Lawrence is given his assignment to go into the Middle East and find Prince Faisal. And it's established that he enjoys putting out match flames with his fingertips. And we'll go much deeper into why he does that when we review Lawrence in the near future. But instead of putting out with his fingertips, he ends that scene by just blowing out the match. And then it instantly cuts to the Jordanian desert, and the sun rising over the desert, which is, probably the most famous scene transition in history. And I think by opening Schindler's List, by the candles going out and then cutting to the German train, that's meant to be sort of a homage to that famous shot in Lawrence.
Which I think is a great technique. Is film directors use it, but we as historical authors, we also use it. I know, like even within my own books, there's certain things that I know that I've like paying homage to different authors that I've liked through the years and everything, because just those techniques are just timeless, and so for him to use that, it's very understandable, and it works. It definitely works.
Yeah. Again, Lawrence of Arabia and Schindler's List are two of the absolute greatest historical fiction films. In my personal opinion, they may very well be like the two greatest ones ever. We want to discuss more of the actual kind of story, or what we think of some of the scenes or how it plays out.
Sure, absolutely, definitely need to do that.
Do you want to start, or?
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay. As far as I don't even want to say favorite scenes, like most powerful sequences, given kind of how heavy this subject matter is. I think some of the ones that stand out. There's a scene where I think was it Amon Gert, who's sort of the commandant in charge of the Krakow ghetto and is sort of like the main villain of the film. He's investigating Schindler's factory, and he finds, I believe it's a rabbi who is in charge of making like widgets. And because the machine, I guess, was recalibrated that morning, he didn't make as many as, he was supposed to. And so Gert accuses him of being lazy. And there's this very sort of dramatic sequence where he's taken outside and they're trying to shoot him. And the gun just sort of keeps jamming. And it just goes on and on for like a couple of minutes. And it's really sort of holding you in suspense the entire time. And I just thought that was, one of the most powerful sequences in the entire film.
And again, like you said, there's so many scenes like that just really, how Spielberg was able to capture that, the emotion behind of what was going on, the horrendous situation that was, that Jews had to live through every single day in the ghetto, and then eventually in the camps. And it was how he was able to really portray that on the screen in such a powerful way. It's even hard to talk about,
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know the scene that you're talking about. I think another one that really stood out for me was, let's see, of course, the little girl in the red coat. I think that's the one that everybody, and I think that's the reason why even Spielberg did that the way he did, because the only color in the entire movie was her. And such a poignant moment of the innocence of her, and I think at that moment, it's like you truly get the sense of what Schindler was trying to do, because it was like he saw her, and then later on he saw her again when she was, dead. And it just was like, he knew at that, it was such a transformative moment to have seen her walking around by herself, and then later to see her with that group of dead people. Yeah, extremely powerful. How he was able to use that imagery to really get across. And again, like I said, it's so hard, it's so difficult to talk about, because the injustice behind all of that happened, and pure inhumanity to man. Very, very heartbreaking. I think, as a mom, another powerful, scene is when the children are taken away. That's and then you have the mothers who have already trained their children what to do, to go hide, where to go hide, and everything. And then, that's a very powerful thing, because I think a lot of times, people get in this mode of that things will never happen like that again. And that's so not true, because it has happened again and again throughout history, even since then, in different countries. And so I think it's what an incredibly powerful lesson for all of us. And yet, it's, the reality is that in the world that we live in, it's not going to change.
Right. I mean,
yeah, you would hope it would, but it's not. History repeats itself again and again.
Yeah, the scene with the girl in the red coat, I mean, that's part of the segment of the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto.
Yeah.
I mean, people frequently discuss, another Spielberg film with Saving Private Ryan, with the opening scene of the beach landing and how powerful that segment is. And I feel like the liquidation of the ghetto in Schindler's List is, right, equally sort of
Oh, yes.
powerful and meaningful. I was kind of surprised to learn when reading the novel that the little girl is in the novel too.
Oh,
Um, and they made and like I don't know if it's pages, but like there's a long description of kind of her red coat as she was sort of either walking down the street or in line or um and that Schindler did sort of hone in on her with the coat.
so then
Um,
that was actually like probably actually happened.
right, and I had always thought that Spielberg sort of invented her, and I was surprised to learn that she's in the novel and likely was a real person.
Oh, wow. That's even more heartbreaking, you know, because we make up characters all the time in our fiction novels, but then that's really hard to take. Really hard to take.
Um, and as far as I'll mention one other or one or two other moments that I thought were as interesting. There's one shot that I noticed in this last watch through that I don't think fully appreciated before that just kind of goes into sort of I guess Spielberg sort of just his filmmaking kind of craft and skills that there's a moment where Schindler is standing by a window watching his workers in the factory and there's a flame down below and that reflects off the window and kind of like covers his heart. And I thought that was, a very, I mean, it's very like kind of directly and, important symbolic, kind of shot that you can sort of use to reflect on kind of how Schindler is trying to process and kind of come to terms with what's going on and what he needs to do. Um, and then one other topic that I think goes into both, I think is an interesting moment, but that then cuts into a frequent criticism that is sometimes made of the film is it's during the liquidation of the ghetto where one German officer, an SS officer, is playing the piano, and there's a debate between two others. Is this Bach or Mozart?
Mm-hmm.
Which is meant to sort of represent, remember this, Germany had a long history, and was a civilized nation, and they still succumbed to this. And to kind of show that, this was not just some sort of, random group of barbarians that just kind of exploded onto the world, that this was, a civilized state, with an incredible cultural history that still succumbed to this.
And that's the reason why I said that about earlier about
Yeah.
people getting their idea, oh, well, you know, we're civilized. We would never, nothing like this would ever happen. But
Right.
they're wrong. People are wrong. This most definitely can happen again and has happened.
Yeah. But so I'd like to discuss, because I mean, clearly you and I both think very highly of this film, but there has been criticism of it made both at the time and since. And one of those points is there enough sort of analysis of sort of why, or just like of the Nazi mindset, I guess, and like kind of why their kind of view of kind of why they're doing this, or are they more just treated as like kind of just stereotypical villains?
That's really interesting. I don't think. Yeah, I can see that. I can actually see that. I think you're right, but I don't know that. Um, I think Ray Fiennes' character was enough to show the mindset of how they were. Talking about poignant moments, that moment when Schindler is trying to discuss with him about how Caesar would hold his thumb up or down
Right. Yeah.
and to show mercy, and that whole discussion with him and how he even tried, he was, but it really portrayed that whole ideal. He was like the epitome of an SS officer. that whole mindset of how they felt about the Jews or any other group that they were persecuting, destroying. It showed their mindset. So I think maybe he kind of embodied that whole entire thing. That maybe it wasn't even necessary to go even more into depth about that, because this movie was about what was happening to the Jews and to the other groups that were being persecuted. So yeah, I can definitely see that for the most part, the German soldiers and officers were pretty stereotypical. But I
Well,
think I think Ray Fiennes' character was kind of embodied everything about that ideal.
but I mean, part of it though is that Ray finds his character is not always, spared from that criticism that like, even Roger Ebert said that like he's treated as though he's, sort of quote, just insane and not, that there's a deeper sort of either psychological or sociological reason why either he's doing this or the other Germans.
That's pretty interesting. So, I mean, I don't know that has there ever been a movie that has been done that has kind of delved into that? That'd
Well, I
be
mean, there's something like Downfall, which shows sort of Hitler and his followers in the bunker at the end of the
yeah,
war. It's not addressed. I mean, I guess it touches a bit on the Holocaust, but just sort of like their just general mindset of, why the Nazis, started the war, what they think they're trying to build, things like that.
hmm,
I mean, I think with Rain Fiennes' character, to me, like the most interesting scene is the one where he's abusing both verbally and then physically Helen Hirsch, um, where I read it as, he does have an attraction for her, but then because of this ideology that he's, a follower of, he's just very sort of torn between kind of like different levels of his thinking in terms of, you know, their quote relationship, and you can just kind of see it play out there, and then he ends up just resolving it by being physically abusive. um so to me, as far as like if we're discussing like sort of the either psychological kind of makeup of the Nazis, I think that scene probably does the most within this film to sort of show kind of how the ideology and just sort of more standard human psychology are interacting.
yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Let's also just touch on, I guess, since we're on this topic, right, the most famous piece of criticism of this film, that supposedly Stanley Kubrick said um, that Schindler's List was not even about the Holocaust, that the Holocaust was the murder of 6 million Jews, and Schindler's List was about 1,000 who survived.
Hmm. Well, I mean, that to me, that's a really big deal. I mean, that there was 1,200 that survived, and all, and I'm sure like it's kind of like in a magnifying glass, you have this man's life, and there was probably others. Of course, we know there was others who tried to do things like we have the family who hid the Frank, Anne Frank and her family. So you have like moments like that throughout that whole those years of the war and everything. So I don't know that you know whenever critics say something like that, to me you have to take the movie for what it is and for what it's trying to portray, because and to like try to portray the whole grand scheme of what happened and everything, because we know that that's what was happening. But he just took like this magnifying glass of this man's life and what he did and the 1,200 that survived. So I mean, I think it. it wasn't it was enough for the film. It was, I don't it's kind of like the Diary of Anne Frank. You know that this is about these people's lives and what they had to endure, in that same time period. And yet we know in the grand scheme of things what was happening around them and all the ones that were killed. And um, so that's kind of a curious critique, I think.
Yeah, so my take of it is I actually think Spielberg did something very important in telling this story because in my view he's almost subverting the Holocaust. And that the film ultimately sort of is making not just a thematic statement, but one of the most important ones in the history of storytelling by showing a German businessman going against what his government was doing and saving 1,200 Jews, that it's showing that sort of morality as a concept survived the Holocaust, that even within some Germans it survived, and that the Nazis lost the battle, not just the war, but they lost the battle for the human soul. And it even is showing that a person's background does not define their destiny. So I think the movie is by telling a true story, it is sort of affirming that morality survived this.
And it's really interesting because coming up soon, like in the next couple of weeks, we'll be having a content episode with the History Bards podcast where I discuss the Berlin airlift and how it the impact of the war on Berliners, because a lot of people aren't aware of the incredible suffering that, while the Nazis were doing all of this, and then whenever Berlin was defeated, when Hitler was defeated, and then the amount of people that were killed in Berlin and suffered, they were starving. And then when the Red Army came in and they pretty much just demolished Berlin, and there was so much suffering. A lot of people don't know that. So it's like, you have all of this that happened at the hands of the Nazis towards the Jews and Jehovah's Witnesses and other groups, but you also have the other side of the citizens who were suffering under that same regime. And it's like I said, it's just like a constant, it's like a domino effect. It's just like one thing after another, and people were just dying right and left. The people that died in the UK, the people that died in Poland, Russia. It just seems like this amount of chaos that was happening and so much injustice all the way around.
Right. We should mention that it's not just that the Red Army captured Berlin.
Right.
It was also that throughout the last half of the war that Britain and the United States were heavily bombing Axis population centers in an effort to try to break Axis morale.
Yes.
And I think in Germany it killed somewhere between 600,000 to over 1 million German civilians, and in Japan it was well over 1 million Japanese civilians. Thinking so.
I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up about, and I thought was really interesting about, let's see, I had written this down because I wanted to bring it out, that it says in a 1983 television documentary that Schindler is quoted as saying, "I felt that the Jews were being destroyed. I had to help them. There was no choice." And so that really goes into, again, the transformation that you see in the film, him going from a businessman who all his concern was making money and making money off the war, because we know that when wars happen, a lot of businessmen make a lot of money, but to see his transformation of him seeing this right in front of his eyes, and whenever he said that in that documentary that he had no choice, and yet there was so many who made the opposite choice to just go right along with it. That really says something about him as a person,
Right. Yeah, the novel quotes him kind of actually right after he sees the girl in the red coat. The novel quotes him that he went back to his office and he said to himself that I have to find some way to defeat the system.
And then in the movie, in portraying him, the heartbreaking whenever he felt like that he could have done more. And, that's really, that really breaks your heart. It really does.
I also just kind of, before we start to wrap up here, I want to touch on the final scene, kind of in this epilogue segment where it jumps back to color in, I guess, what was the present day when it came out in 1993, of the Schindler Jews visiting his gravesite in Israel, both with the Jews themselves, who are obviously older than they were back during World War II, and then with the actors portraying them. I think as recently, Schindler's List is one of the greatest historical fiction films, especially one based on a true story. And I think by including that, it is saying not only did this happen, but it shows what that type of, what the subgenre can do, of whether we want to call it biographical fiction or just historical fiction based on true events, that it can portray this story and make clear to the audience that this happened. This is not just a fictional story set in the past. This is it's a work of art about a real event. And I think that it's a very special genre, and I think that scene is something that only this genre can do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I've said that a lot through our podcast and to other historical fiction authors, that it's so special because, again, you can teach something, and again, some authors will use the genre for entertainment, and that's fine, but to take it in such a deep and meaningful way like that, to be able to teach something to whoever's reading it is extremely powerful.
Right, and I think, some sort of purists probably dislike the entire concept that you would take a real story and fictionalize it or fictionalize aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think by building a work of art out of real people and events, that it is able to both be a piece of entertainment that can be sort of more easily digested than a purely factual account like a documentary or a nonfiction book, but while still conveying an educational sort of lesson about history and the world that we live in. So, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. That we know it's about as heavy of a subject matter as we can possibly discuss. But we will see you next week with another classic historical fiction film. So keep on making history and keep on listening.
Thanks. Bye. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the History Bards Historical Movie Reviews. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and follow us at our YouTube channel at the Historical Fiction Company or on Spotify.